Snow over the fields. The harvest that never came sounds harmless until you place yourself there. You stand in a field that promised grain by August. You helped turn soil by hand. You watched seedlings rise. Then winter pushed in early. Frost spread across rows like white cloth laid over graves. Days darkened. Nights stretched longer than sleep. You searched for signs under frozen earth, but nothing rose. Families bartered tools for bread. Neighbors burned seed stores for heat. You walk along the rows again, thin boots sinking in snow, tracing where crops should stand tall. You count each empty stalk and wonder how long hands hold warmth without work to shape them. The fields stay silent. Snow listens. We follow Ruth Hargrove, a woman who lived with her brother Thomas on a small farm near the northern border. Their land once fed 3 families each year. They worked dawn to night through spring, planting seeds by hand, marking soil with careful rows. When winter rushed in early that year, frost covered their fields before harvest. They waited for thaw. No thaw came. Snow piled waist high and dirt hardened like stone. Ruth kept watch from a small window, hoping supplies lasted until spring. Thomas walked miles to mill towns, searching for aid. Nights long, wind loud across empty hills. Before we sink deeper into these still fields, tell me where you listen from and what hour rests beside your bed. Pull a blanket closer. Let your shoulders drop. Slow your breath until your chest softens. If this quiet keeps you company, press like softly, subscribe without effort, and leave your town name in the comments so I know who stayed awake with me. Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of wind dragging snow across the windows. At first she thought it passed like any early storm that brushed fields, then faded by noon. She stood from her straw mattress and wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders. The floor cold under her feet. The room dark except for faint grey. Light slipping through frost. She moved to the small kitchen where Thomas already sat on a stool, elbows on the table, staring at the stove. He had not slept. He held a kettle in his hands, waiting for water to heat, though no fire burned yet. Ruth knelt, gathered thin sticks, and set them beneath the grate. She struck a match. Flame rose slow, barely enough to warm their hands. Thomas nodded toward the door. Snow covered the porch rail. He said the storm arrived faster than predicted. Ruth listened to wind howl against the eaves. She took a deep breath, then pulled her coat from a hook near the stairs. They stepped outside together. The cold hit their skin, sharp and unfriendly. Snow stretched across fields that still held crops not ready for harvest. Rows of grain stood half-grown, trapped under frozen blades. A thin crust of ice formed at the base of each plant, sealing the earth before it reached full strength. Ruth walked down the first row, touching stalks with the back of her glove. The stems snapped when bent. Thomas walked ahead, boots leaving clear tracks. He knelt near a patch where soil crumbled thin through frost. He dug with his hands, breath short, uncovering roots that turned grey and brittle dot. Ruth stood silent, watching her brother work. She knew the truth, but waited for him to say it. He brushed dirt from his hands and stood. The crop lost. They had planned to bring in harvest within 2 weeks, enough to feed families through spring. Frost took what the soil promised. They walked back toward the house with slow steps. Snow thickened. Ruth looked at the horizon where barns of neighbors stood small and silent. No smoke rose from their chimneys yet. She wondered if they woke to the same sight and chose to stay inside rather than face what waited outside. Inside their kitchen, the kettle steamed. Ruth poured warm water into 2 cups and placed one in front of Thomas. He held it between both hands without drinking. She sat across from him, watching his jaw tighten. He said he would walk to town. Ruth asked if he needed supplies. He shook his head. He needed answers. He wanted to know if other farms lost their crops too. Ruth looked down at the table. She wanted to go with him, but knew someone needed to watch the house, tend the stove, and protect their small store of grain sealed in metal tins. Thomas wrapped a scarf around his neck and pulled on his heavy boots. He reached for the door, then paused and pressed his forehead to the wood for a moment. The house felt quiet behind him. Ruth stepped closer and touched his arm. He turned and wrapped her in a brief embrace, arms tight around her shoulders, as if storing warmth before stepping outside. Then he left. Ruth watched through the window as he walked down the road, leaning into wind. Snow swallowed his tracks within minutes. She pressed her hand to the glass, feeling cold seep through. She spent the morning gathering wood behind the house, the pile shorter than last winter. They planned to cut more after harvest. Now she carried pieces inside one armful at a time, stacking them beside the stove. She sharpened the blade of the hatchet and placed it near the door in case new branches fell from trees along the ridge at midday. She walked to the barn to check on the cow they kept. The animal stood still, breath visible in long streams. Ruth brushed frost from its coat and spread dried hay across the floor. The supply of hay limited. She hoped to trade cloth for more once Thomas returned with news. She checked the chickens next. They huddled close together near a wooden crate, wings pressed tight. She broke ice along a small water trough and placed feed mixed with small grains. They pecked slow, beaks stiff from cold. When she returned to the house, smoke drifted from the chimney of the nearest neighbor. Ruth watched snow settle on the fence between their lands. She thought of visiting but lacked strength to speak yet. She closed the door and sat near the stove. Hours passed. Light faded. Wind softened. Ruth carried a lantern onto the porch. She waited, listening for footsteps. Snow crunched faintly in the distance. She lifted the lantern higher. Thomas approached, shoulders drooped, his coat covered in ice, his hands numb from cold. Ruth rushed forward and helped him inside. He sat near the stove and removed his boots with slow, clumsy movements. She handed him hot water from a kettle she heated earlier. He held the cup and breathed into it, face pale. She asked what he learned. He said every farm along their road faced the same fate. Crops froze before harvest. Some farmers tried digging plants from soil, hoping to salvage roots. The roots broke. Others planned to cut stalks and dry them indoors, though nothing held enough strength to feed families through winter. Grain stores in town thin. The mill shut down until thaw. Supplies shipped from farther south weeks away. Ruth placed her hand on his knee. He said the council met at dusk with plans to ration resources. They asked Thomas to return tomorrow for discussion. He agreed, though he wished he had more to offer. He felt their land failed not only them, but others who relied on them. Ruth sat beside him. She rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed silent until the room darkened. Thomas stood to stir the fire and added another log, though he hesitated before dropping it. Knowing each piece mattered. They ate a thin stew made from root vegetables stored in a small crate. Ruth added herbs to stretch flavor. Thomas chewed slowly, eyes fixed on flames. After eating, Ruth washed the pot with melted snow warmed on the stove. Thomas wiped the table and placed cups upside down on a cloth. Before sleep, they checked the fields one last time. Lanterns cast small circles of light against endless white. The rose hidden beneath ice, the wind quiet, as if tired from its own force. Thomas stood near the fence and looked toward distant barns. Ruth stood beside him. They did not speak. The night settled around them like heavy air. Snow fell thin and steady. They returned inside. Ruth curled under blankets. Thomas slept, sitting up against the wall. The stove glowed faint, heating only the room around it. Outside, the fields stayed silent under snow. Ruth woke to soft knocking at the door. She rose, tightened her shawl, and stepped across the room. When she opened it, the neighbor from the farm south of theirs stood there, shoulders hunched, scarf pulled to his eyes. Behind him, snow rose to his knees. He asked if Thomas reached town and returned safe. Ruth nodded and stepped aside so he could enter. He removed his gloves, placed them near the stove, and warmed stiff fingers. His name was Warren. A man who raised 2 daughters alone after illness took his wife the year before. He carried a sack slung over his back. Ruth placed a cup of hot water in his hands. He sipped slow. Warren said his youngest daughter woke with fever. He lacked broth to ease her breathing. He came to trade cloth and nails for a small share of herbs Ruth stored from last season. She opened the drawer near the stove and measured handfuls of dried leaves into a small tin. She handed it to him. He placed 2 folded blankets and a pouch of nails on the table in exchange. Warren paused before leaving. He asked if she walked the fields since the frost. Ruth nodded. He lowered his gaze. He saw tracks across his land where rabbits dug for scraps of green. He found only frozen roots. He feared snow covered more than soil this year. Ruth placed a hand on his arm, steady and without rush. Warren thanked her, pulled on his gloves, and stepped back into the snow. He walked toward his home, movements slow from fatigue. Ruth watched until he disappeared over the small ridge. She closed the door and leaned her back against it, head lowered. Thomas woke soon after, rubbing his eyes. He asked who visited. Ruth explained. Thomas set his jaw and pulled on his coat. He planned to return to the council building in town to learn ration plans. Ruth gathered cloth and tied it in a bundle to trade, if needed. She placed it in his hands. He pressed his forehead against hers for a moment, then left. Ruth decided to check on Warren and his daughters before tending their own fields. She filled a pot with broth from last night's stew, added herbs, and covered it with cloth. She wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and stepped outside. Snow packed deep across their path. The wind mild but cold, heavy in the air. Ruth took each step with care, following faint tracks Warren left earlier. She reached his home after a long climb up the hill. Smoke rose from his chimney, though thin and unsteady. She knocked. Warren opened the door with relief visible in his eyes. Ruth stepped inside. His daughters sat near a makeshift cat. The younger one lay curled under blankets, cheeks flushed, her breath shallow. Ruth knelt beside her and placed the pot near Warren. He ladled broth into a small cup and held it to the child's lips. She swallowed slowly, eyes half open. Ruth sat with them for some time, helping mend torn gloves and patch small holes near window frames where wind entered. Warren thanked her again and asked how long their supplies lasted. Ruth told him they saved enough grain to stretch several weeks if careful. Warren nodded, though worry stayed in his face. Before leaving, Ruth stepped outside to check their barn. Snow drifted against the door. She brushed it away and pushed inside. Haystacks shorter than she expected. Warren must ration for his animals more than he admitted. When she returned home, she set more logs near the stove. Her hands numb from cold. She rested only a moment before walking out to the fields again. The sky hung low, heavy, grey. Snow settled across rows where plants bent beneath ice. She walked each row, pressing her foot against frozen earth. The ground felt firm enough to support weight, but held no life. She knelt and dug with gloved hands. Soil brittle. Roots snapped like thin sticks. Her breath formed long streaks in the air. She stood again and looked. Across neighboring farms, doors stayed shut, smoke thin above rooftops. Families silent inside. Ruth returned to the house when wind rose. She wiped snow from her coat and hung it on a peg. She warmed fingers above the stove. Then she sat at the table and took out sheets of parchment. She wrote a list of remaining supplies: grain, dried, vegetables, herbs, pieces of cloth, tools, wood. She counted each item twice, the numbers small but manageable. She folded the parchment and left it under a cup so Thomas saw it when he returned. Afternoon passed in slow rhythm. Ruth tended the cow again, brushing flakes from its back. The animal pressed its head against her side, seeking warmth. Ruth whispered soft words, though her lips trembled. Back inside, she patched a tear in Thomas's coat. She stitched cloth along seams to reinforce worn areas. Needle moved slow through thick fabric. Light from the window faded to dim grey. Thomas returned after dark, covered in snow. He inhaled deeply, then sat at the table. Ruth placed hot water before him. He thanked her, voice tired. He explained the council's new plan. Grain in town would feed households with children first. Those without children received less. Farmers asked to contribute stored supplies to shared reserve. Thomas accepted. He offered half their tins to the council. Ruth listened and nodded, though her throat tightened. Thomas said men from eastern farms planned to break paths to distant mills farther south. The journey long and dangerous through snow-covered roads. No horses strong enough to pull wagons now. They planned to carry supplies on sleds by foot. Thomas agreed to join. Ruth lowered her gaze. She asked when he left. He said dawn 2 days from now. Ruth pressed her hand against the table, steadying herself. She asked if he thought the mills had enough to share. He paused, unsure, but did not voice doubt. He placed his hand over hers and held it there. They ate broth in silence. When finished, Ruth washed dishes and dried them by the stove. Thomas rubbed at his temples, fighting fatigue. Ruth placed a folded quilt behind his back. Outside, wind slowed. Snow fell soft. The moon struggled through clouds. Before sleep, Ruth stepped outside alone. She walked to a patch of fields near the fence line. Snow piled thick. She crouched and pressed her hand against the ground. She whispered a wish, not for growth, but for strength to endure stillness. Then she stood and returned inside, Thomas already asleep, head resting against wall. Ruth pulled blankets over him. She lay down near stove. The youngest chore left undone could wait until morning. The night passed without storm. The fields remained silent under snow. Ruth woke before light reached the windows. The air inside chilled her face and hands. She reached for the coat beside her and pulled it tight before leaving her blankets. Thomas still slept, breathing slow and deep after long travel the previous day. She placed wood in the stove, struck a match, and fed small flames until heat reached the room. Snow piled outside the door again. She pushed it open with her shoulder and stepped into the grey dawn. Silence stretched across the land, broken only by distant creaks of ice shifting beneath layers of frozen soil. She walked to the barn with a lantern in hand. The cow stood near the stall door, stamping its hooves in slow rhythm. Ruth stroked its neck and spread hay across the floor. She refilled the water trough with snow she melted over embers. The animal pressed its nose against her coat, searching for warmth. Ruth rubbed its head before returning to the house. Thomas woke by the time she returned. He sat at the table eating small pieces of bread from last week's batch. Ruth sliced the loaf thinner and placed half aside for supper. Thomas laced his boots and tied cloth around his neck. Today he met the council again to prepare for the journey south. He told Ruth the group gathered at the large barn near Town Square. The place once stored grain in tall bins. Now the bins nearly empty. Ruth paused with her hand on the stove, listening. Thomas continued, saying they needed to count remaining tools and sleds before travel. He asked if she wanted to come. Ruth agreed, though she felt uneasy about leaving the house unattended. She wrapped her shawl and slipped her arms through her coat. Together they walked down the snow-covered road. The path to town took longer than usual. Snow drifted over fences and stone markers. Trees bent under weight of frozen branches. Ruth held her lantern low, though daylight soon replaced its glow. As they approached the main road, smoke from chimneys grew thicker. Families stood outside, some carrying bundles of wood toward the square, others gathering around cart frames without wheels. Horses not present. Most stables stood cold, feed too thin. The council's barn stood tall near the center of town, though the roof sagged from heavy snow. Ruth and Thomas entered through large double doors, the interior dark except small fires placed in metal trays. People gathered in clusters, whispering. Empty grain bins lined one wall. A few bins held crumbs swept into corners, nothing more. Ruth walked along the bins, touching worn wood. She remembered years when overflow spilled onto the floor. Now her footsteps echoed in hollow space. An older woman approached Ruth. Her name was Lorna, a seamstress who once sewed sacks for grain shipments. She held a clipboard and asked if Ruth could mend torn canvas used to wrap sled runners. Ruth agreed. Lorna guided her to a corner where several men repaired wooden frames. Ruth sat on a stool and threaded needle through rough canvas, each stitch steady, each pull a slow anchor against fear creeping into her thoughts. Thomas stood near a group of men planning the route south. Maps spread across a table weighted by stones to keep corners from curling. One man traced a line across the page, showing frozen streams and fallen trees blocking old paths. They needed to move around the ridge instead of through it. Travel took longer but avoided steep ground. Thomas listened without interrupting. When asked if he led the front party, he hesitated before agreeing. The group needed someone who knew the land well. Thomas traveled those roads many seasons. Ruth heard his voice from across the barn as he listed landmarks still visible under snow. Hours passed. Ruth mended 3 pieces of canvas. She stood and stretched her back, hands stiff. She walked toward the doorway for fresh air. Outside, children gathered along the fence, dragging sticks across snow to draw crooked rows. They pretended to plant seeds, pressing palms flat to frozen ground. Ruth watched them, heart tightening. They played at harvest, though none waited beneath frost. A woman approached carrying a sack of dried beans. She offered Ruth a handful, saying her husband traded metal scraps for extra food at dawn. Ruth thanked her and placed beans in a jar inside her coat. She promised to bring something in return tomorrow, back inside the barn. Thomas joined Ruth. He told her the group set out before sunrise in 2 days. They planned to carry only what they needed to survive. Most supplies reserved for return trip. Ruth nodded, though her hands trembled. As evening approached, they walked home. Snow fell in thin sheets, drifting across the road. The sky turned pale blue, then dark. Lantern light shimmered faint against white fields. Near their house, Warren waited with his older daughter. She held a basket lined with cloth. Warren greeted Ruth and Thomas quietly. He said the younger daughter's fever eased since drinking the broth. Ruth's chest eased at the news. He opened the basket. Inside sat 3 small jars of honey collected before winter. He offered them to Ruth in trade for the herbs she shared earlier. Ruth tried to refuse, but Warren insisted. She accepted 1 jar and pushed the others back. Warren nodded, grateful. They talked a moment about council plans. Warren considered joining the second party, heading south. He lacked strength to leave his daughters alone, though he wanted to help. Ruth said she understood and placed a hand on his arm again. After they left, Ruth and Thomas stepped inside their house. The stove burned low. Ruth warmed stew using leftover broth from the night before and added a handful of beans. Thomas removed his coat and sat with shoulders slumped. They ate in silence. Ruth rested her hand on Thomas's forearm. He breathed slow, eyes heavy. After eating, he stepped outside to gather more wood. Ruth cleaned the table and folded cloth strips to store in a tin. Later, as night deepened, they sat near the stove together. Ruth asked Thomas if he feared the journey. He did not answer quickly. He said fear served no purpose but lingered just the same. He assured her he knew the paths well. She nodded, though worry settled like weight in her chest. They slept early. Ruth curled beside the stove. Thomas lay close enough to hear wind scrape the walls. Outside, snow fell steady through night. The barn in town stood quiet under heavy sky. Fields lost beneath frost did not stir. Light filtered through clouds in pale strips across the table when Ruth opened her eyes. Thomas, already awake, sorting ropes and canvas ties he rolled the night before. The stove burned low but steady. Ruth rose, placed more wood inside, and stood close until warmth reached her hands. Thomas said the council asked each household to send bread for the men walking south. The loaves needed to last days without mold and stay firm through cold winds. Ruth nodded, pulled her apron from a hook, and prepared dough from the last sack of flour they opened. She mixed water warmed from the kettle, salt, and what grains remained from the bucket near the wall. She worked slow so nothing spilled as she needed. Thomas carved marks into wooden tags to tie around each sled, so travelers identified bags in darkness. The carved strokes, sharp. His hands moved with rhythm learned from years shaping fence posts and barn beams. Ruth placed dough near the stove to rise. She wrapped cloth around the bowl to protect it from drafts. She then stepped outside and shoveled snow from the small path leading to the gate. Wind soft, sky flat. Her breath rose in faint trails. She walked to the shed and retrieved a small box of dried berries saved for winter sickness. She planned to place some inside loaves to give travelers strength. The berries tasted tart but stored nutrients from late summer sun. Back inside, she checked dough. It rose enough. She shaped small loaves instead of large ones so they fit sled bags. While bread baked, Warren arrived again, this time with his older daughter carrying a stack of wooden slats. He asked if Thomas needed extra boards for sled repairs. Thomas thanked him and placed the stack beside ropes. Ruth handed Warren a cup of warm water. His daughter removed her gloves and held hands near the stove. The girl mentioned her. Sister slept longer that morning and woke without fever. Ruth smiled, relieved. Warren said he planned to send a small parcel of wool socks for travelers. He could not join but wanted to contribute something that kept their feet from freezing. Ruth nodded, knowing each gesture mattered. Warren gathered his daughter and stepped into snow. Thomas returned to carving tags. Ruth removed bread from the stove and set them to cool on cloth. The scent filled the room, gentle and bittersweet by midday. Ruth packed 3 small satchels with bread, dried berries, and strips of cloth to wrap hands. Thomas tested the sled harness with ropes, adjusting knots until no slack remained. Ruth watched, feeling weight settle across her chest. She knew he left before dawn tomorrow. She walked to the fields alone for a moment of stillness. Snow packed across stalks she once tended with care. She brushed snow aside from a patch and traced the ground with her finger. Soil froze deep. No thaw sign. She whispered a simple thought: grow when time turns. Then she stood and walked back toward the house. When she arrived, Thomas prepared his coat and boots. Ruth stitched one final patch near his shoulder. She told him to tighten straps often while walking so cloth did not tear under wind. He nodded. As light faded, Ruth and Thomas traveled back to the council barn to deliver supplies. Snow crunched beneath boots. Several men gathered outside, tying lanterns to sled handles. Others placed blankets on long tables. Inside, Ruth handed her satchels to a council member. The woman checked contents, nodded, and placed them among other provisions. The pile modest but organized, Thomas joined a group finalizing travel order. Ruth stood before him, placing her hand over his chest. Thomas pressed her knuckles against his lips. He promised to return with grain or news. When they left the barn, the sky shifted to deep blue. Snow glittered beneath moonlight. They walked home without speaking, steps slow, breath steady. Inside, Ruth hung coats by the door. Thomas sat on the floor and leaned his back against the wall. Ruth knelt beside him and covered both of them with a quilt. They stayed like that for a while, listening to faint wind against roof. Later, they laid out blankets near the stove. Ruth placed her hand over Thomas's forearm and held it there until his breathing slowed. She did not sleep for hours. She watched the outline of his face in dim light, tracing features with her eyes. When sleep reached her, she dreamt of fields without snow. She woke before dawn, unsure if dream warmth lingered or faded. The morning arrived quiet. Thomas stood dressed, boots laced, coat layered, rope across his shoulder. Ruth rose quickly. She covered his scarf, buttoned his coat near the neck, and tucked hair behind his ear. He lifted his satchel, stepped outside, and looked back once. Ruth raised her hand. He nodded and walked down the road, lantern bobbing toward the square. Others joined him, their lights forming a thin line through darkness. Ruth watched until light vanished behind ridge. She closed the door, leaned her forehead against wood, and breathed slow. She returned to stove, fed fire, and sat at the table. The house felt larger without Thomas's footsteps. She folded blankets, swept snow from the threshold, and prepared broth for midday. She needed tasks to fill hours before worry found space to grow. By midday, she walked to Warren's house to check the children. Snow deeper along the path. She paused halfway to rest. Warren opened door when she arrived, surprised to see her, but grateful. The younger daughter sat near stove with flushed cheeks but clear eyes. Ruth smiled. Warren shared wood strips he collected from fallen fences. He asked if she needed help with chores. Ruth declined politely and stepped outside after a short visit. She returned home and mended gloves, stitched holes in sacks, and swept small flakes near window frames. Evening arrived without storm. The sky muted, clouds thick but calm. Ruth sat alone near stove, hands folded. She listened to wind scrape snow along walls. She imagined the travelers walking through deep drifts, far from warmth, lanterns dim. Boots heavy, she whispered to the quiet room. Return safe. The house held silence. Ruth woke late the next day, the house colder than usual. She rose, added wood to the stove, and wrapped a quilt around her shoulders. The space beside her remained empty, reminding her that Thomas walked miles south with others through deep snow. She sat a moment in silence before rising to begin morning chores. She poured water into a pot to heat. She sliced the last loaf stored from earlier in the week, setting aside small pieces for the cow. The animal needed steady food to stay strong through cold. The path to the barn held deeper drifts, after wind pushed snow across open yard. Ruth trudged through, boots sinking. The barn stood stiff under frost. She opened the door, and warm breath escaped from the cow's nostrils as it recognized her presence. Ruth brushed settled snow from its back, spread hay, and whispered soft words to calm herself more than the animal. Inside the house again, she ate a small bowl of thin broth, holding the cup close to her face for warmth. She looked toward the table where Thomas carved wooden tags. The tools still sat in their places. She placed them in a small box to keep shavings from scattering. She knew long hours waited. Days without sound from town felt heavy. She needed something to anchor her thoughts. She pulled out parchment and began writing without ink, tracing letters with dull pencil to save supplies. She wrote messages to Thomas, though no courier traveled north until his return. The letters kept her hands moving, kept her mind from wandering the frozen paths he walked out in the first letter. She wrote how morning sunlight fell across frost like small crystals. In another, she wrote of Warren's daughters improving. She described the barn, their fields, and how she counted barrels again to ration supplies. Words pressed faint into parchment but carried her breath. She finished 3 letters before midday. She folded them and placed them in a small tin near the window. She planned to hand them to Thomas when he returned, so he read all she wanted to tell him during silence. Around noon, Ruth walked to town to share news about supplies and check for any travelers who returned early. Snow heavy, sky thick with clouds. She wrapped her scarf high across her face and carried a lantern, though day held light dot by the time she reached the square. Smoke curled from chimneys and groups of families stood near the council barn. She entered through large doors. Inside, the space felt colder, without many bodies moving. Women organized blankets for children who waited in line for small portions of grain. The grain measured by cups instead of bags, enough to stretch meals through week. Ruth offered 2 cloths she stitched the night before to patch torn sleeves. A woman thanked her and handed her a small tin of salt from their storage. Ruth slipped it into her coat pocket. She asked if any word from the travel party arrived. The council leader shook his head. He said the men planned to send signal from Old Mill if they found passage open. Smoke from tall chimney would drift north across valley. Without smoke, no sign. Ruth nodded and left barn. She stopped at Miller's house to greet Lorna, the seamstress. Lorna sat by a stove, sewing new sacks from torn cloth. She asked Ruth to sit and warm her hands. They spoke about weather, paths to distant towns, and how long children lasted with thin meals. Lorna said she missed hearing laughter in the square. Ruth listened, offering quiet presence rather than answers. After a short visit, Ruth returned home. Snowfall light but steady. Her boots left faint marks across fields. When she reached her house, she placed parchment letters in a safer box and set it on a shelf. She boiled snow for fresh water and prepared simple stew from remaining vegetables. She stirred slow, letting steam soften air. She ate alone, bowl warm in her hands. Evening settled early. She lit a lantern near window so passing neighbors saw signs of life. She sat at table and stitched small mittens from scraps left in drawer. The mittens too small for adults but perfect for children if illness struck again. She heard footsteps outside. She stood, walked to door, and opened it slowly. Warren stood there, hat pulled low. He held half a sack of wood. He said wind knocked down part of an old fence near forest line, leaving wood scattered. He gathered what he could and shared the extra dot. Ruth thanked him and brought wood inside. She asked how his daughters fared. He said both slept quietly that night and woke with more strength. He looked tired but lighter in expression. She asked if he needed herbs again. He shook his head but accepted mittens she made. He said he planned to take his daughters to Council Barn tomorrow for ration. He placed the mittens in his pocket then left. Ruth closed door and stood still. She watched how lantern flames swayed when wind pushed against walls. She reached for her coat again. She stepped outside and looked across fields toward the ridge. She saw no smoke from distant mill. The sky clear enough that smoke signals would show. She watched for several minutes, then returned indoors. She placed spare logs in stove, sat near warmth, and picked up parchment again. Tonight she wrote more letters without ink, describing evening sky. She wrote words she struggled to speak while Thomas stood near her. She wrote how silence in house felt heavier than frost on windows. She wrote how she missed hearing boots on floor. She wrote how she guided each day forward. She folded each page carefully by night's end. 10 letters rested in tin. She slept near stove once more, wrapped tight in blankets. With letters near her hand, outside, wind quieted. Snow continued falling in thin sheets. The path to the ridge remained untouched by returning travelers. Ruth woke before dawn, startled by a noise outside. The wind low, steady, but something scraped against the wall. She sat up, pulled on her coat, and stepped toward the door. She opened it a small amount. Snow drifted against the frame. She squinted across the yard. Faint lines cut through the snow, leading toward the orchard behind the shed. She stepped outside with her lantern raised. The cold bit her skin. She followed the footprints, careful not to disturb their shape. The prints narrow and uneven, dragging in places, as if made by someone unsteady. Ruth moved slowly, each step sinking through layers of untouched snow. The orchard stood quiet. branches heavy with white weight, bark coated in frost. The trees no longer bore fruit since the freeze struck early. She walked around the first row and found fresh marks in snow near the old cider press. She knelt to inspect the tracks. They looked like a child's footsteps, smaller than Thomas's, smaller than hers. The pattern wandered in circles, drifting closer to the fence line. She followed until the tracks crossed into a stretch of trees that leaned toward the road. Beyond that point, the snow flattened and wind erased details. She stood still, listening. No voice, no movement, only wind brushing branches. Ruth turned back toward the house, checking the barn on her way. The cow safe, tucked into straw. She closed the door and went inside. She sat near the stove, warming her hands, trying to place the tracks in her mind. They did not belong to Warren's daughters. They rarely walked at night in deep snow. No other children lived close enough to travel that distance without adults. She decided to speak to Warren later. For now, she prepared breakfast from thin stew left from last night and a small handful of dried berries. She ate slowly, staring at the window as pale morning light broke through clouds. After chores, Ruth filled a satchel with herb leaves and spare cloth strips. She planned to walk to Warren's house to check on the children before heading to town. Snow light but constant. She pulled her hood tight and stepped onto the path. The air colder than previous days. Breath left her mouth in sharp bursts. As she neared Warren's house, smoke rose steady from chimney. She knocked. Warren opened the door with relief. His older daughter sat near stove, sewing a torn scarf. The younger leaned against her pillow but looked stronger. Ruth sat and helped mend a small tear in mittens. She asked if either girl walked outside last night. Warren shook his head quickly. He said both stayed inside, too cold to leave bed. He asked Ruth why she looked troubled. She told him about footprints near Orchard. Warren listened with a crease between his brows. He said he heard nothing last night. He worried someone traveled through fields in search of food. They parted on that thought, promising to stay watchful. Ruth continued toward town. Snow shallow but ground uneven beneath. She reached the square and found families gathered around small fires built in metal barrels. Women stirred water into flour to stretch meals. Men repaired handles on sleds for future use. Ruth entered Council Barn again. She delivered herbs to one woman treating a child with cough. The woman gave Ruth half a candle in return. Ruth needed candles now. That night stretched without Thomas's lantern beside hers. She placed it in her pocket, grateful. She approached the council leader and asked whether any travelers returned with news. The leader shook his head. The group should have reached the ridge by now, though snow slowed progress. Ruth walked to the back of the barn where sacks of grain once piled high. Only a handful of sacks remained. A man measured portions, spoonful by spoonful, into containers for each household as she watched. Lorna approached, carrying cloth cut into long strips. She handed Ruth a bundle, asking her to sew edges smooth. Ruth agreed, folding cloth under her arm. She stepped back into cold air. Evening approached early, clouds heavy. She walked home before night trapped her on the road. Halfway there, she stopped suddenly. She saw footprints along the fence line near the orchard again, fresh, not covered by wind. She lowered her lantern closer. The snow stamped deeper this time, as though weight increased. She followed a short distance, stopping near edge of trees. Beyond that point, only faint marks remained, then nothing. She scanned horizon. only grey light fading past hills. Ruth walked back toward the house faster than before, heart uneasy. She entered, latched door, and set lantern on table. She prepared supper from broth and one slice of bread. She ate while sitting in silence. When finished, she wrapped leftover bread and stored it in a tin lined with cloth. She lit the candle she received earlier, its flame small but steady. She placed it near the window so Warren saw light if he walked by. She sat with needle and thread, finishing edges of cloth Lorna gave her, her stitches neat and patient. Later, she opened the tin of letters she wrote for Thomas. She added another page describing footprints. She wrote that she hoped whoever walked through orchard found shelter before frost took them. She wrote she missed the sound of his steps across floor. When she set letter aside, she heard faint crunches outside. She rose, walked to window, and peered out. She saw nothing at first. Then a shadow moved near orchard's first row, small and quick. Ruth held breath. The shadow faded behind trees. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside slowly, lantern in hand. She walked toward orchard. Wind quiet. Snow still. She reached first row and found fresh tracks. Now larger, as if someone older than a child walked alongside smaller prints. Ruth called out softly. No answer. She stood still, listening again. A branch snapped farther in. Then silence. Ruth backed away toward house, deciding not to chase shadows in dark. She entered, shut door, and slid wooden bar across. She sat near stove and waited for breath to slow. Night moved slow. She slept little, waking often to check window. No new movement. No new tracks visible from porch. The house settled into stillness. Morning returned, pale and heavy. Ruth woke stiff from little sleep. The candle burned halfway down. Wax hardened along the table. She pushed blankets aside, fed wood into the stove, and waited for heat to spread across the room. Her thoughts returned to the orchard, 2 footprints that deepened through night. She breathed steady, calming herself before starting chores. She stepped outside before sunrise to check the path. Snow smooth except for one trail leading toward the orchard. The prints from last night settled with slight drift but still clear. She crouched and placed her hand near one of them. The distance between steps lengthened, as if whoever walked moved faster. She walked to the barn. The cow shifted impatiently, hooves tapping the floor. Ruth brushed flakes from its back and spread hay. She poured warm water into a tin and placed it near its mouth. She lingered, leaning her forehead against the animal's neck, letting its warmth push against her thoughts. Back inside, she boiled water and poured it into a cup. She ate leftover stew from the night before, now cooled and thick. She sat in silence, staring at coat hooks near door where Thomas's coat once hung. She touched the empty space beside hers. As afternoon approached, Ruth wrapped cloth she sewed for Lorna, placed it in a satchel, and set out for town again. Wind stronger than yesterday, drifting snow across road. She leaned forward as she walked, steps slow but steady. Along the way, she checked Orchard Trail once more. The prints now scattered into brush. Halfway to town, she met Warren walking in opposite direction. He carried a bundle of broken fence planks, tied with rope. He greeted her and asked if she slept. She shook her head and described shadows near orchard. Warren frowned. He offered to return after he dropped wood to inspect ground with her later. Ruth agreed. They parted, and she continued to town, the square filled with quieter voices than days before. People moved slower, wrapped in thicker layers, saving energy. Ruth entered council barn and delivered the cloth strips. Lorna thanked her and placed a small jar of ointment in her hands, useful for cracked skin. Ruth tucked it in her coat. She asked again if any signs of travelers reached town. The council leader looked toward Ridge and said, "Snow too heavy to see signals even if smoke rose." She nodded, though her heart tightened. Ruth walked through town, offering small help where needed. She shoveled snow near mill door. She carried a crate for a woman with weak arms. Small tasks kept her steady. She left town by evening, eager to return before darkness hid tracks. As she neared her house, Warren waited near gate. He stood silent, watching orchard. Ruth approached, and he pointed toward tree line. A small figure crouched near the first row of trees, back turned to them, head low. Ruth raised her lantern, letting light stretch across snow. The figure flinched, stood, and took one step backward. Ruth stepped forward slowly. The figure hesitated, then ran toward the far side of orchard. Ruth called out, voice calm, offering warmth and food. No answer. The figure disappeared into deeper snow behind shed. Warren walked beside Ruth, searching for fresh prints. They followed tracks until distance and brush broke path. Warren squinted into tree shadows, but saw no movement. He said whoever passed looked young, small, thinner than a grown traveler. Ruth pressed fingers to her brow, thinking. She asked Warren if any families lost children recently. Warren shook his head. Illness took many adults, but children present stayed close to home. He said someone could travel beyond Ridge, alone, seeking shelter. They returned to house. Ruth lit lanterns inside and placed bread on table. She offered Warren stew before he left. He declined politely, saying he needed to settle his daughters for night. He promised to check on orchard again tomorrow. Ruth sat alone, listening to wind slip through cracks. She wrapped a blanket tighter and stared at the door, half expecting knock. Later. As she prepared to sleep, she placed a bowl with warm broth on porch, covering it so snow did not ruin contents. She set a wool scarf beside it. If the visitor returned, they found warmth waiting. She sat by window until candle burned low. She drifted to sleep near stove, letters for Thomas beside her. The night passed without noise. When dawn arrived, she rose quickly and opened door. Snow hardened on porch. The bowl empty. The scarf missing. Footprints led away toward orchard once more. Ruth felt a slow ache in her chest, mixture of relief and concern. Whoever passed took food but left no message. She stepped back inside, warmed her hands, and wrote another letter in tin, describing the quiet exchange. Words faint against parchment. She walked to Warren's house to share news. He answered door with tired eyes, but listened closely. He asked if she wanted him to stay near orchard tonight. She said not yet, wanting to see if visitor approached alone again. Warren agreed, though concern stayed in his voice. Ruth returned home, moved through chores carefully. She mended sacks, swept snow through cracks in doorway, and folded blankets. She rechecked their stores, counting jars again. Supplies shrank, week by week. Near dusk, she stepped outside. She placed another bowl on porch, this time thicker broth, covered tightly. She set folded cloth beside it again. She lit a lantern and left it hanging by door so light spread across yard. Then she returned inside and waited. She did not sleep at once. She sat by window, watching snow settle. Hours passed. Flame dimmed. her eyes heavy. Finally, she lay on blankets, though she kept lantern lit indoors. Sometime in night, she woke to faint crunches. She sat up, silent, watching window. A small shadow passed across porch. Ruth stayed still. The visitor approached, bowl, knelt, and ate. Then they took cloth and turned to leave. Ruth whispered through door, "Stay." The figure froze but did not turn. They ran into snow, leaving prints trailing behind orchard. Ruth pressed her palm against wood, letting silence answer. She stepped onto porch only after shadow vanished. She checked bowl, now empty. She looked at tracks, deeper than last night. She returned inside, sat by stove until morning light reached floor. Ruth woke with stiff shoulders and sore eyes. Dawn seeped through clouds in faint streaks. She rose from the blanket, stretched her hands, and fed wood into the stove. Heat crawled across the room inch by inch. She stood at the door before opening it, steadying her breath. Snow drifted along porch again. The empty bowl from last night rested where she left it, but fresh footprints marked a curved path back toward orchard. She stepped outside. Lantern held low and followed the trail a short distance. The prints closely spaced, uneven, but not trembling like before. Whoever visited ate well enough to walk without collapse. Ruth stopped at the first tree, looked deeper into orchard, and turned back. She did not want to chase someone still choosing distance. She carried the bowl inside, washed it, and set it near stove to dry. Then she prepared thin porridge for breakfast, stirring slow. Her chest felt heavy from questions without answers. She remembered the faint shadows, thin arms, small shoulders, quick movements. She wondered where they slept, how long they wandered, why they walked alone through winter fields. Ruth packed a bundle of cloth scraps and herbs, planning to take them to Lorna. She set out after chores. Snow deep, but packed from constant travel. As she neared Warren's house, he stepped outside holding a lantern. He greeted her quietly. His daughters stayed inside, sewing. He asked if the visitor returned. Ruth nodded. She described the gathering on porch, the quiet eating, the flight through orchard. Warren frowned, then glanced toward ridge, thinking. He offered to check fields behind his house at dusk. Ruth thanked him and continued to town. In the square, voices low and tired. The council barn felt colder inside than outside. Ruth delivered cloth to Lorna, who offered thin strips of leather in return. Ruth accepted and slipped them into her pocket. Near the back wall, she overheard men speaking about wolves near forest line. They spoke of tracks found near livestock pens. They planned to watch fields at night. Ruth listened but said nothing. A child wandering alone through fields risked more than cold. Ruth asked again about travelers who left for mills. Still no word. Snow blocked high paths. The council leader said a second team prepared to leave soon if no signal came. Ruth's pulse quickened. Thomas walked same route. If a second team left, the first likely struggled. She left barn earlier than usual, anxious to return home. On the road back, wind pressed hard against her coat, shaping snow into narrow ridges around her path. She paused often to breathe, hands cold even under cloth. She reached her house near dusk. She set items on the table, warmed broth, and wrapped a second scarf to leave outside. She placed it on porch again, alongside bowl of thick stew. She attached a small note scratched in faint pencil, safe inside. Night fell slow. Ruth sat near window, lantern dim. Hours passed without sound, her eyes heavy, but she refused to sleep fully. Then she heard the faintest shift of snow, softer than footsteps. She moved to the door without noise and waited. She opened the door only a crack. A small figure crouched beside the bowl again. Lantern light stretched across their face for the first time. Dirt smudged across cheeks, hair tangled, eyes wide and watchful. Their coat thin, seams torn, sleeves short above wrists. They gripped the scarf as if unsure whether to keep it. Ruth whispered, voice soft, no urgency. She asked if they needed shelter. The child flinched, stepping back. They looked toward orchard as if prepared to run. Ruth stepped outside slowly, lowering herself to sit on porch, hands resting in lap. Space between them open. Snow drifted between them. Ruth spoke again, offering warmth, food, a place to sleep safe from wind. The child stood frozen, breathing shallow. Ruth asked their name. No answer. The child stared at blanket hanging from porch rail. Their eyes held more exhaustion than fear. Ruth pointed to door, but did not move closer. She told them she left bowl for them again tomorrow, whether they entered the house or not. The child looked down, then lifted bowl with both hands. Drinking slow, when finished, they placed bowl on porch and stepped backward. They whispered something too faint to hear, then turned and ran toward orchard again. Ruth watched until shadow vanished. She stayed seated a long time, letting lantern burn low. Snow settled on her sleeves and hair. When cold reached her bones, she finally rose, carried bowl inside, and shut door. She wrote another letter to Thomas, explaining encounter in detail. She folded it and placed it in the tin. She wished he stood beside her to see the child himself, to speak gently as he always did. Night ended without further movement. In morning, Ruth followed tracks deeper than before. She saw not only small prints, but larger ones nearby, as if someone older walked with child. She crouched and examined stride length. Not Warren, not Thomas, not anyone she recognized. She walked to Warren's house to share news. He listened, jaw tight. He said he would check north fence by afternoon. Ruth thanked him and returned home. She gathered a heavier blanket, cut into narrow strips so child wrapped themselves without dragging weight. She prepared another bowl, thicker stew, and set both on porch long before dusk. As light faded, she sat by window again. Wind quiet. Snow settled slow. Hours passed. Then footsteps once more. This time slower, hesitant. Ruth rose, held lantern, opened door carefully. The child stood there again, holding blanket strips loosely. They looked at Ruth for longer than last night. Their lips cracked, fingers thin. They lifted one hand halfway as if wanting to speak, then lowered it again. Ruth stepped outside and sat as she did before. She asked if they wanted to sit inside where wind stopped. The child shook their head. Ruth asked if someone walked with them earlier. The child lowered gaze and nodded once. Ruth asked if that person still near orchard. The child nodded again but looked away. Before Ruth said more, the child turned and ran to trees. Ruth did not chase. She watched until shadows swallowed them. She took one long breath and returned inside. The house dim and still. Ruth slept only a few hours. Her dreams broke into short pieces of footsteps in snow and unanswered questions. When she finally rose, pale morning spread across her fields in smooth white sheets. Winds lighter than past days, but cold, sharper, as if air held no softness left for breath. She dressed in layers, wrapped her scarf tight, and stepped outside. The porch empty except for faint snow gathered against doorseam. She knelt to examine ground. The small prints from last night crossed orchard again, but this time curved eastward, a slope she rarely walked. She followed for several yards until wind erased trail. She kept walking past orchard edge until landscape turned uneven, marked with patches of frozen weeds. Halfway down the slope, she found something new. Larger footprints, deeper than child's. The steps spacing long, weight heavy, direction south. They seemed to intersect the smaller tracks, then split apart as if person walked beside child for a stretch before veering away. Ruth crouched and traced edges with her glove. Whoever walked here watched the child from more than distance. She stood slow, thoughts gathering heavy. If someone older guided child, why keep them hidden? Why approach her house but not speak? Ruth scanned valley below. Thin tree lines, old fence posts, half buried in snow, broken barn foundation from a farm long abandoned. No smoke, no light, no sign of shelter. She walked farther until she reached remnants of that old farm. Only a collapsed roof and stone chimney remained. She circled structure, looking for footprints. Snow undisturbed. Nothing there. After an hour, she turned home, legs tired and face numb. As she approached house, smoke rose from roof, thin strands drifting sideways. Comfort pulled her back inside. She warmed broth and pressed hands around mug. Later, she prepared to walk to town. She wrapped blanket strips and tucked extra bread in her bag. The road hard and rutted. She passed Warren's property first. He waved from stable, then came to Wardgate. She told him about new tracks and abandoned farm. He listened in silence, brows drawn. He said he searched north fence last night, but saw nothing. He said wolves lingered near far ridge, though none crossed fields close to homes. He offered to check east slope at dusk. Ruth thanked him. He looked unsettled, but didn't ask more. The walk to town slow. Rugged patches of snow made steps uneven. She reached Council Barn after midday. People gathered near long tables, sorting rags, shaping rough cloth around cold hands. Lorna waved her over. Ruth handed supplies, then asked if any new travelers passed through. Lorna shook her head. Roads farther south blocked for days. No mail arrived. Steam line delayed. Ruth kept listening through hushed talk around room. Some spoke about livestock freezing in outbuildings. Some about children falling ill from smoke-filled cabins without proper chimneys. One man near corner spoke of hearing voices near forest line at night, though he never saw figures. Ruth stayed quiet but paid attention. When leaving, she stopped at crate near entrance to sort herbs again. She packed dried thyme and narrow strips of bark for fever. She placed them in her coat pocket. The walk home felt longer. Sky dimmed early. Wind shifted from east to north, pushing snow crosswise over fields. Ruth reached her house long after sunset. She lit lamp and sat by window, watching shadows spill across orchard. She prepared stew thick with barley and set bowl outside on porch. She added dried meat and set folded blanket strips near corner where snowdrift least. She sat near door again, listening. Hours passed. She closed eyes, but not deep enough for sleep. Then faint sound again. Snow, crunch, light, deliberate. She stepped toward door and opened it slow. The child stood farther from house than before. holding blanket strips from last night wrapped around shoulders, their face drawn tight, eyes darker underneath. They glanced over shoulder toward trees. Ruth looked too, but saw only shifting shapes of branches. She asked if the older person nearby tonight. The child nodded once. Ruth asked if they wanted food. The child stepped forward, lifted bowl with 2 hands, and carried it to the steps, not leaving as quickly as usual. They ate slower, careful. Ruth stayed outside again, not trying to speak too much. She asked only if they slept near trees. The child nodded. She asked if they wanted thicker coat. The child paused, then looked away. They whispered again, still too faint to hear. Ruth stood and stepped inside to fetch heavier coat. When she returned, the child was gone. Tracks led toward orchard again. Wind scattered flakes across porch. She placed coat near rail and returned inside, the night heavy. Ruth fell asleep in chair. She awoke at dawn to faint tapping outside. She stepped out quickly. The coat gone. Tracks again led to orchard, deeper than before. Ruth pulled boots on and followed. She walked through orchard to slope. She followed prints farther than morning. She moved quickly, breath short. Halfway down slope, she found something new. Strands of thread caught on branch. Faded blue, frayed edges. Not from the blanket she gave. She pocketed thread, then kept walking. The prints led into narrow passage between rocks. She moved through, then saw a hollow area where snow shallow under tall pines. In that space, storage crates half buried, an old wagon wheel leaned against tree trunk. Someone had been there long. She knelt near crates, some empty, others filled with broken cloth scraps. Tools rusted and left open to air. Footprints circled area, then continued toward deeper woods. She turned around. She did not want to follow farther alone. When Ruth returned home, Warren waited at her porch. He held lantern and looked troubled. He said he saw smoke near ridge at dawn. Too thin for a full fire, maybe small camp. He asked if she wanted him to go there tonight. Ruth shook her head. She wanted to wait and see if child returned without direct pursuit. He did not argue. He left after brief talk, though he looked back several times. Ruth spent rest of day gathering wood. She set aside more food. She prepared a cloth bundle with herbs, bread, and wool. She planned to offer it to whoever walked beside child in woods. Night arrived slow. Ruth sat near window again. Wind lower, snow soft. When faint footsteps came, she rose. Ruth opened door. The child stood closer tonight, eyes tired but calmer. They pointed toward slope, then toward Ruth. She stepped outside and followed a few feet. She asked if someone needed help. The child nodded. Ruth walked to edge of orchard, but stopped when trees thickened. Child waited near tree trunk. Then she heard new sound deeper in woods. A voice low, strained. She called out softly. Silence followed, then voice again, short and weak. Ruth took 2 steps forward but stopped. She told child she would return with supplies in morning when light better. The child looked torn but nodded once, then ran back through woods. Ruth watched the darkness long after they vanished. She walked home slower. Heart heavy, Ruth slept through first hour of morning without stirring. When sunlight passed through thin curtains, she rose with stiff legs and throat dry. She packed supplies as promised. Bread wrapped tight, strips of wool, herbs in small pouch, flask with thin broth, and flint. She layered clothes and stepped outside. Snow new and soft, not deep, but smooth over all older prints. Fresh tracks pressed through orchard toward woods. She followed slow, the air hushed under tall pines. Branches heavy with frozen needles bent low. She reached narrow cut between rocks where she found crates last day. This time she pressed farther. Tracks led downhill toward hollow. A thin curl of smoke lifted through trees. She moved toward it until she saw small clearing ringed by fallen trunks and drifted piles of snow. There they were. The child lowered head when she approached. Near them, on ground, rested a man wrapped in torn coat, one leg extended stiff, his beard thin, cheeks sunken, hands bruised from frost. He looked older than she expected, perhaps late 40s, though hunger sharpened age on his face. He watched her without alarm, more tired than wary. Ruth knelt beside him and set bundle on snow. She asked if leg injured. He whispered a short answer, words slow. He said he slipped near ridge during storm, landed hard on rock, lost balance and twisted knee. He dragged himself this far, leaning on child for support. He said they stayed here nights, hiding from wind under broken wagon boards. Ruth asked where they traveled from. He glanced towards south. He said village near river once thrived until last harvest failed. Mills slowed. Snow struck early. They fled north in search of work or supply. He stopped speaking, breath shallow. She opened broth flask and lifted it to his lips. He drank small amount. She pressed herbs into boiling cloth she brought and wrapped his hands. She checked his leg next. Swelling harsh around knee and heat radiated through bandage. She looked around, clearing. No shelter except slanted boards held up by branches. Snowdrift pushed under those boards during wind. They needed more cover. She told him she would return later with Warren's help. He closed eyes and said thank you, voice rasped. She asked child to stay with father. They nodded, eyes wide. Ruth rose and left clearing slow so she did not disturb thin snow covering crates. She walked home as wind gathered stronger. Halfway through orchard she saw Warren walking toward her with rope and sacks. He said he followed tracks after sunrise. She told him about father and injury. He looked grim but determined. They loaded sled with blankets, lantern, wood, and small iron sheet. They walked together toward clearing. When they arrived, child watched from behind tree, relief plain across face. Father raised head weakly when they entered. Warren knelt to examine injury. He said knee damaged but not broken. If they supported him, he might walk with help, but not far today. They set blankets into triangle of boards and packed snow against outer sides to break wind. They lit lantern and started. Small fire on iron sheet to keep ground from melting uneven. Ruth sat beside child while Warren worked. She asked child's name. They whispered Eva. Ruth repeated it and nodded. She asked father's name. He answered Samuel. Ruth introduced herself and Warren. Their names settled into air like fragile truce. As fire grew, Ruth passed bread. Samuel ate, slow but finished every bite. Eva sat closer to flame, hand stretched toward heat. Ruth noticed their coat worn beyond repair. She pulled wool strips from pack and wrapped Ava's arms. They smiled small. Warren asked if they wanted to travel to town. Samuel looked at child before answering. He said they stopped in past towns but found no rooms. He wanted to reach coast, though roads blocked. He did not know if another route east existed. Ruth said they could stay near her land until storm season eased. He nodded, gratitude quiet. They worked through midday to strengthen shelter. Warren cut branches from fallen pine and layered them against boards. Ruth packed snow tight along sides to block wind. Eva gathered small sticks near tree trunks. Samuel rested under blankets, eyes half closed. By late afternoon, the shelter grew stable. Ruth suggested moving them closer to Orchard tomorrow, where wood supply easier. Samuel agreed, but looked unsure if he could manage distance. Warren said he would help with sled if needed. As sky dimmed, Ruth and Warren prepared to leave. Eva walked them to tree edge. Ruth promised to return with soup. Eva nodded and held on to wood strips. On walk home, Ruth spoke little. Warren asked if she thought others hid in woods. She said she did not know those signs long visible. He asked if they should tell council. Ruth said soon, but not before Samuel grew stronger. They parted at Splitting Road. Ruth reached house after dark. She warmed leftover stew and poured into large jar. She rested for short time, then stepped outside again with jar wrapped in cloth and lantern. Wind lower now, but fog formed along field edges. She walked orchard rows until trees opened toward slope. She followed tracks back to clearing. Eva waited outside shelter this time, lantern in hand. Ruth handed jar and told them to eat warm. Eva carried jar inside while Ruth stepped closer to shelter and asked Samuel how he felt. He said pain eased a little. Ruth did not linger long. She left them to rest and returned home walking slow. That night she lay in bed instead of chair. For first time in days she let sleep hold her steady. Morning came with new snowfall. Ruth helped Warren prepare sled. They packed thick blankets, rope, and crate of food from town storage. They walked together to clearing again. Samuel sat upright now, face less pale though pain clear. They decided to move him. Warren lifted Samuel's good shoulder while Ruth guided sled. Samuel leaned on sled edge and took slow steps across packed snow. Eva walked beside, holding coat edges tight. They reached Orchard after long effort. They chose small, hollow, near back fence line sheltered by pines. Warren set boards against trees to form safer shelter and added old door panel. Ruth stored and shed to block wind. Samuel sat against tree trunk while Ruth built fire again. She boiled broth and added herbs. They ate in silence while snowfall drifted steady. Ruth watched Eva trace shapes in snow near fire. After meal they spoke about next days. They planned to keep shelters stocked and warm. Warren offered to bring tools tomorrow to build stronger frame against pines. Samuel agreed and looked grateful. As afternoon faded, Ruth returned home to gather more blankets. She stopped near porch and looked across fields. Snow-covered soil like endless sheet. She saw orchard fence posts lined in shadow. She thought about harvest that never grew, but also about hands gathered now beneath trees. She walked inside, lit lamp and sorted small spare clothes for Eva. She folded them and tied string round bundle. Night came slow. Wind whispered across roof. Ruth stepped outside with bundle underarm. She walked toward shelter again. Lantern light glowed through branches. She handed clothes to Eva, who looked surprised, eyes wide. Ruth smiled small and said nothing more. She walked home again through orchard with snow-soft underboots. Ruth woke before sunrise with thoughts steady and clear. She sensed new weight in the air, not from storm, but from word spreading through farms that strangers lived near Orchard. Rumors traveled without feet. She stepped outside to breathe cold morning air. Smoke from her chimney drifted upward in straight column. Sin wind slept. She prepared bread and filled 2 jars with thick stew from pot warmed on stove. She wrapped them in cloth and set them aside before walking to orchard again. Tracks familiar now, lines pressed back and forth between home and hollow near fence. At shelter, Samuel sat upright near fire, his posture steadier, pain less severe, though breath still slow. Eva fed fire with narrow sticks, face warmed by orange light. Ruth set jars beside Samuel and asked how leg felt. He said stiffness lessened, though muscles weak. She offered cloth strips to wrap knee. He nodded. They ate together in silence while thin snowflakes drifted past branches. After meal, Ruth said she planned to walk to town barn later. Samuel watched her with caution. She said she wanted to speak with counsel before rumors twisted past reason. Samuel lowered gaze but did not object. Eva moved closer to fire, listening. Ruth assured them she would not share every detail. She wanted to keep trouble from growing. Sun rose higher. Ruth stood and prepared to leave. Samuel thanked her with few words. Eva walked to 2 trees, then returned to shelter. Ruth crossed orchard and followed road west toward town. Fields sat quiet, fences half buried, hills smooth white. Upon reaching town, she saw a small crowd gathered near barn. Many carried blankets or broken tools. Supplies grew thin. Wind burned skin on uncovered faces. Ruth entered barn where council gathered near center table. Lorna waved her over with exhausted smile. Ruth shared a short account. Travelers injured near her land, staying under pines, need shelter until roads clear. She did not mention location or condition beyond simple facts. Council listened in silence. One member asked if they trouble farms. Ruth said no. Another asked if they planned to settle. Ruth said storm trapped them and journey paused. She did not speak more. Lorna looked thoughtful. She said supplies stretched thin and everyone strained. She said no one turned away travelers before and no reason to change now. Others nodded, though some faces held hesitation. Rumors always fed fear during long winters. Council agreed to gather small crate with cloth and dried beans. Ruth thanked them and offered to transport supplies herself to ease concern. They agreed. She stepped outside to breathe air far from voices. As she left barn, Warren approached from stable road. He carried rope and wood. He asked if council understood. Ruth said they supported aid but wanted slow approach. Warren nodded. He said he wanted to meet Samuel tonight. Ruth agreed. They walked together part of road before splitting toward separate farms. Ruth returned home to warm stew again. She packed crate and loaded sled. She rested short, then walked back to shelter. Snow deeper by afternoon, but still manageable. At shelter, Samuel dozed near fire. Eva sorted sticks. Ruth quietly stacked beans and cloths inside crate. When Samuel woke, she told him about town meeting. He listened, tense, shoulders raised. When she said council supported aid, his shoulders dropped. He said he feared forced removal. Ruth said winter left few options for long travel. He nodded slowly. Later, Warren arrived, carrying narrow beam and small metal hooks. He introduced himself to Samuel with calm voice. They spoke about leg, fields frozen, mills silent. Eva watched conversation close, eyes moving from one to the other. Ruth stepped aside to let them speak, Warren began reinforcing shelter. He used beam to secure top corner where snow dripped through boards. Ruth helped by holding planks while he hammered hooks into trunk. Samuel watched with quiet gratitude, though he tried not to show emotion. As dusk neared, Samuel asked about harvest. Ruth said fields never grew past seedlings. Samuel said same happened along river. Frost turned soil before grain reached half height. He said mills shut early, workers scattered across towns. Ruth realized his journey north mirrored countless others. They continued talking until sky darkened. Warren prepared to leave. Ruth walked him halfway through orchard. Snow faint fell across branches. Warren said he trusted Samuel, though wanted to remain cautious. Ruth agreed. They parted quietly. Ruth returned home and sorted remaining supplies. She slept lightly again, though rest deeper than previous nights. Next morning, wind rose stronger. Drifts formed along lower road. Ruth pulled cloak tight and walked toward shelter again. She found Eva alone near fire, arranging stones in circle. Samuel slept under blankets, face pale but calm. Ruth sat near child and asked if they slept well. Eva nodded. Ruth took items from crate, wool shirt, mittens, dried fruit. She handed them to Eva. Child smiled small and folded shirt as day stretched. Ruth noticed worry flicker across Eva's face when wind howled. Ruth asked what troubled them. After long silence, Eva whispered about others from river. She said more families left village. Some headed east, some west. She did not know if any found shelter. Ruth listened without interruption. She asked if they wished to send message to anyone still south. Eva nodded, but did not know where to send. Ruth said she could ask counsel about mail routes once roads opened. Eva looked hopeful. Later, in afternoon, Samuel woke and sat up. They ate stew together. Ruth asked if he wanted to stretch leg by walking short distance. He hesitated, then tried to rise. With Ruth's help, he stood and leaned on sled. He took several steps forward, pain visible, but progress clear. He paused near tree and looked toward orchard. He said he forgot how fields looked when covered in silence. Ruth stood beside him without speaking. After a short walk, he returned to shelter and rested again. Eva curled beside him, leaning head against his shoulder. Snow fell steady but soft. As evening settled, Ruth prepared to leave. She told them she would return next morning. Eva held bundle of clothes and nodded. Samuel thanked her again with quiet voice. Ruth walked home through orchard slow, snow brushing ankles. She reached house and lit lamp. She sat near window watching shadows move across fields. Night passed calm. Ruth slept deeper. She woke before dawn to muffled knock at door. She opened door to find Lorna with parcel. Lorna said council wished to provide extra blankets once supplies arrived. She asked if Ruth needed help transporting items. Ruth thanked her and said she would handle. Lorna smiled faint, then left. Ruth packed blankets and stepped outside again. She felt steady now, part of larger effort. On path to shelter, she saw new tracks leading toward camp, not from orchard but from north fence. She followed them for short distance, but turned back when route dipped into deeper snow. She stored thought quietly. When she reached shelter, Samuel sat upright, bandaged leg supported by folded cloth. Eva tended fire. Ruth delivered blankets and food. As they ate together, she asked Samuel if he saw others near camp last night. He shook head. Ruth looked toward deeper trees again, but did not speak further. Ruth stayed longer near shelter that morning. Samuel shifted weight on injured leg with steadier balance. Eva walked small circles around clearing, tracing patterns in snow, checking sticks for fire. Ruth noticed tension in Samuel's stare toward deeper trees. He sensed something too. She stepped outside clearing to gather pine branches. Snow fell in thin flakes, drifting slow. When she lifted first branch, she saw faint tracks crossing slope from north, shaped like older boots, stride wide, direction unclear. Not recent enough to be fresh, but not old either. She stepped back and returned to fire without speaking. Samuel asked why she paused. She told him she saw prints she did not recognize. His eyes narrowed. He asked if anyone followed them from south. Ruth said she did not know. They ate stew and shared dried fruit. After meal, Samuel tried walking farther. He took slow steps between trees, leaning on sled handles. Ruth walked beside him. Eva followed close. When Samuel stopped to rest, he turned toward north again. He said River Village lost not only harvest but order. Some left with anger, some with little hope, some drifted without plan. He did not know where each group traveled. Wind pressed branches together above them. Whispering faint sound. Ruth suggested they build second. Windbreak near shallow ridge to block gusts that swept through clearing. Warren arrived mid-morning with planks from scrap pile. He lifted them into place while Samuel guided position and Eva packed snow around gaps. Ruth fetched stones and laid them in small ring for new fire pit. Work simple but steady. Each voice low and calm. By midday, clearing felt safer, less exposed. Ruth sat on log beside Samuel. She asked what kept him moving north if roads blocked. He said he aimed for coast ports, though he did not know if ships still traveled. Ruth nodded. She thought of her own fields silent under snow. Work paused without promise beyond frost. Eva returned with a bundle of sticks and sat near them. Ruth asked if Eva remembered last night's wind. Eva nodded and said she heard footsteps near ridge but too far to see. Samuel listened stiff. Ruth asked if footsteps moved toward them or past. Eva said past, heading east. As sun sank low, they prepared for evening. Warren left early to beat rising gusts across open fields. Ruth stayed until first shadows stretched long. Before leaving, she set 3 lanterns in line near orchard edge to guide path in dark. She told Eva to follow lights if storm worsened. Eva nodded. Ruth returned home. She heated thick broth on stove and wrapped blanket around shoulders. She sat near window and watched orchard fade beneath grey dusk. Hours later, she rose and stepped outside to check lanterns. All 3 still lit. Wind stronger now. Snow tossed sideways across fields. She slept little, waking twice to check lights. The second time she looked out, she saw faint movement near orchard edge. Not close, but near where tracks once crossed toward abandoned farm. Shape low and quick, then gone behind trees. Morning arrived with deep drifts. Ruth packed food early and started toward shelter. Wind lower than night, but sky full of thick clouds. She reached clearing and found Samuel sitting outside windbreak, face pale with cold but awake. Eva slept inside, shelter bundled tight. Ruth noticed new prints again near northern path. Samuel saw her stare and shook his head. He said whoever passed did not speak or approach. He heard footsteps but no voices. Ruth knelt beside fire and warmed hands. She discussed with Samuel the thought of moving them closer to her house for stronger protection. He hesitated. He said he did not want to draw burden to her door. Ruth said village, weathered years of strangers passing. He said he needed time to think. Eva woke and joined them. They ate warm bread and broth. Ruth asked if Eva wished to learn how to mend cloth with needle from her kit. Eva nodded. They sat together while Ruth demonstrated long stitches across torn coat sleeve. Eva took needle and tried, hand slow but steady. Samuel watched with quiet pride. Afternoon stretched. Warren returned to add more planks. He spoke about town concern growing as stories spread. He said council asked if Ruth kept travelers safe. Ruth said they remained sheltered and peaceful. Warren said he trusted her judgment. Samuel thanked him. As Warren prepared to leave, he asked Samuel if he worried about people from south following. Samuel looked down then, said he left without anger, but others left without plan. If any wandered north too, they might search shelter here. Ruth listened close. Evening approached. Ruth stayed near clearing longer than usual. She gathered pine needles to lay inside shelter for insulation. Eva arranged them. Samuel rested with blankets round shoulders. As night fell, Ruth lit 2 lanterns near clearing. She told Samuel she would leave 3rd lantern at orchard edge again. He nodded. She walked home through steady snowfall. Near porch, she paused and looked back toward orchard. Faint ring of light from lanterns glowed through trees. She stood still to listen. Wind soft now. Silence, heavy. She stepped inside and warmed hands by stove. She filled jar with stew again, then rested until moonlight touched roof. Without planning to, she stepped outside again and walked toward orchard. She lifted lantern high and moved through rows. Halfway to clearing, she noticed new prints crossing her path from north, fresher than morning, snow crisp around edges. She followed them several yards until they curved away from clearing toward deeper woods. She stopped. She placed lantern on ground and stood still, breath shallow. She turned back. She did not want to pull Samuel into fear without proof. She walked home slow. Morning returned pale. Ruth packed food and walked back to shelter. Samuel sat alert at entrance. Eva stood behind him. Ruth sensed tension before speaking. Samuel said footsteps returned again before dawn. He heard crack of branch and soft crunch. No voices. Ruth sat near him. She told him her own sighting. He listened, jaw tight. They decided to send Warren to North Ridge before sunset to check old fence line. Samuel said he would stay near shelter. Ruth agreed to keep lanterns lit along orchard. Most of days spent reinforcing shelter walls. Ruth hauled more branches. Samuel wrapped his knee tighter and stood longer. Eva cleaned snow away from path between orchard and shelter. Late afternoon, Warren arrived. He carried lantern and short axe. He left in silence toward ridge. Ruth, Samuel, and Eva watched from clearing until his lantern disappeared. Ruth stayed until dusk, then walked home. She lit lanterns along orchard and then placed single large torch near fence. Snow fell slow. She stood in doorway long after arriving home. She watched orchard fade into night. Light from lanterns lined path, faint and steady, before sleeping. She wrote single line on scrap paper. Tomorrow, speak to council again. Ruth woke to quiet, wind gone. Snow settled smooth across fields without new drifts. Sky pale blue through thin clouds. She dressed and stepped outside before stove fully warmed. Prints from lantern path still faint in frost. She followed them to orchard and paused to listen. Nothing moved. She walked toward shelter with jar of broth tied to rope for easier grip. As she reached pines, she saw Eva sitting near fire, alone. Samuel slept beneath blankets, breathing steady. Ruth sat beside Eva and warmed hands. They spoke little. Silence settled soft, as if trees held breath. When Samuel woke, he stood slower than previous day, but without looking strained. He walked few steps toward ridge to test strength. Knee held. Ruth noted progress. She told him Warren checked Northridge last night. Samuel asked if he returned. Ruth nodded, though she had not spoken with him yet. Mid-morning, Ruth saw Warren's lantern through orchard. He walked up slope toward shelter, clothes coated with frost. He sat near fire and took warm broth from Ruth. He said he followed tracks along ridge until they faded in deeper snow near ravine. He saw no camp, no figures, no smoke. Prince moved east, then vanished where wind swept ground bare. He thought whoever passed moved on. Ruth watched Samuel hear this. His shoulders eased, though tension lingered near eyes. Eva turned toward deeper trees, then back to fire. They spent days setting final improvements around shelter. Ruth stitched heavier cover for entrance. Eva aligned stones around fire pit. Samuel carried small logs, despite pain. Warren hammered hooks into trunk for tools. Snow melted slightly under sun, though air still sharp. Roof of shelter shed thin crystals down slope. Ruth walked short distance to gather pine cones for kindling. She felt ground soft beneath boots. Spring not close but approaching. Later afternoon, Ruth said she planned to speak to council once more to arrange supplies for week ahead. Samuel hesitated, then asked if he should join. Ruth said travel might strain leg. He looked toward orchard long before deciding to remain. Eva stayed with him. Ruth walked alone to town. Road clearer today, though ice lingered. She reached a barn where council met again. She told them travelers healing, shelter secure, no trouble seen. Council agreed to send flour and salt. They discussed future routes once roads thaw. Some farmers planned to travel east to trade. Others waited for mail to resume. When meeting ended, Ruth stepped outside barn and looked across silent town. Smoke rose thin from chimneys. Children walked along path, dragging sticks in snow. She joined Warren near stable. They walked partway back together before taking separate paths. Ruth returned to orchard and slowed when she saw faint figures near slope. Samuel stood outside shelter, leaning on branch. Eva beside him. They watched last light sink behind hills. Ruth joined them without word. They spoke about routes north and east. Samuel said he thought about staying until full thaw, then heading toward rail line if open. Ruth said she could help pack supplies. Eva whispered about wanting to see town before leaving. Ruth promised she would bring her soon. Dusk deepened. Ruth left them with extra blankets and walked home. She kept lanterns low tonight, fewer flames needed in calm weather. She stepped inside her house and felt warmth settle around her like old memory. She sat near window and watched sky turn dark. Next morning she woke later than usual, tired from weeks of worry. When she stepped outside, she found footprints leading from shelter to orchard and split into two directions. One set curved toward town path. Other moved deeper into woods. She followed orchard route first. She reached shelter and found Samuel sitting with bundle beside him. Wearing coat Ruth helped mend. Eva stood ready with small pack on back. They looked prepared to walk. Samuel said roads opened enough to reach crossing east. He wanted to move while weather mild. Ruth felt mix of relief and sadness. She handed them bread wrapped in cloth and small pouch with herbs. Samuel held items slow, voice quiet. He thanked her without many words. Eva approached Ruth and hugged her around waist. Ruth rested hand on their shoulder. Warren arrived moments later carrying short rope. He offered to walk with them until Ridge. Samuel accepted. They began moving through orchard, steps steady. Ruth walked beside them to slope. She stopped where ground turned rough. Samuel turned and nodded. Eva waved. They continued east through trees until shadows swallowed their forms. Ruth stood long after they vanished, listening to quiet. She walked back through orchard with slower step. She reached house and placed empty jars on table. She sat, hands still. Sunlight spread across floor in narrow beams. Afternoon passed. Ruth checked shelter and cleared ashes from fire pit. She gathered stray cloth scraps and stored them away. She left lanterns unlit that night. Orchard darker but no longer filled with waiting. Next day she walked to town. She told council travelers moved on and left peacefully. Lorna nodded, relief plain. People talked of thaw coming. Mills planned repairs. Farmers prepared soil to break once ground softened. Ruth returned home and stepped onto porch. Field stretched white and endless. Snow not gone but shrinking near fence posts. Soil waited underneath. She watched for a long while. She thought about season ahead, slow work of turning earth again when ground opened. Evening settled. She lit lamp and wrote simple lines on scrap paper. Spring will return. Seeds wait patient. She slept early that night. Deeper than weeks before. Oh, UTRO. Thank you for staying through harsh fields and silent nights. I hope your mind settles and your breaths slow while you rest. When dawn reaches you, treat it gentle. If this story kept you company, leave your town name in comments so I know where warmth reached. Next time we will travel farther north to a cabin, where letters froze in saddlebags before delivery. Before you leave, there is a quiet gift waiting in description. A short list of winter sleep sounds taken from old farm recordings. Rest well now.